using Vipassana meditation and going through a kind of traditional trajectory of exploration through the four foundations, I thought today we would discuss a more applied way of practice. I have a structured approach I call meditation interventions through the addiction process, which is a way of exploring the pattern of uh, the mind in addiction. I developed this system using both Alan Marlat's work. G. Alan Marlat was a researcher up at the University of Washington, Washington State. He looked at patterns that lead to lapsing and relapsing in addiction. Um, and Understanding that these patterns that tend to lead to relapse or lapse, maybe we should make a distinction between the two. A lapse would be a single incident of reusing or re-engaging the addiction process. I don't really personally make much distinction between substance addiction and process addictions. And a full-blown relapse. So how that's defined is lapse is a return to the use of a process, and a relapse would be a return to the same extent of using that you were engaged in before you tried to stop. Often we talk about the stages of change and other things in gauging where someone is in the process. But the focus of meditation interventions through the addiction process is really around people who have been able to achieve either a harm reduction or an abstinence approach to their addictive process, and the focus then on preventing lapsing or relapsing. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the difference between a harm reduction approach or an abstinence approach. In harm reduction, you want to reduce the use of the substances or behaviors so that it's not self-destructive. In the research that Marlat did, he talked about, say, alcohol abuse as limiting alcohol to 2 ounces per day for a male and 1 ounce per day for a female. So you'd have a rigid limit. And in engaging this, let's say you wanted to decide whether you had a drinking problem or not, you would engage harm reduction strategy. As a male, could you limit yourself to 2 drinks a day and do that for a period of time, say 90 days or 180 days, without a single episode of violating the restriction? If you could do that, then you would find that harm reduction was probably a viable approach for limiting the harmful aspects of over-drinking. But that if you couldn't do that, then harm reduction probably would not be an approach that was usable for you, and that abstinence might be the way to go. In the system of meditating around relapse prevention, that is, meditation interventions for the addiction process, I've divided it into 4 modules, and in the coming weeks we'll discuss each of them individually, but I wanted to give an overview today. The first module is called Craving and Urging. So craving is the automatic response to a situation that results in the mind thinking of using. So it could be either substance or process addiction. You have a normal bandwidth, say, of emotion that you can easily regulate. And so any experience in the present moment that flows through at an emotional intensity within that bandwidth, you can simply process. But if something happens that causes an emotional event that exceeds the normal bandwidth, then you have an emotional event that needs to be regulated. Most of us do that through a thinking process. So that if the way that you're currently set up, like to say currently wired to handle the emotional regulation of that, is to use then when that emotional event opens, the mind thinks of using. So it's a kind of automatic response, an indication of how you're set up to regulate emotional experience that's reactive to the present moment. If you allow then the mind to think of using, that's called urging. So the repetitive thought process around planning using or fantasizing about using or remembering using is urging. So the first module, Craving and Urging, explores the opportunity that craving and urging has to lead you to relapse. The second module is called Stress, Anger, and Depression, and what that looks at is how the emotional regulation systems that are embedded in thinking that lead to strong afflictive emotions persisting over time can lead to depression, and how depression is also one of the paths that leads to people relapsing. The third module of meditation interventions is called persistent negative emotion, and really what we're looking at here is trauma, the somaticized experience of emotion that's held in the body, waiting later processing, and how this somaticized emotional experience has a tendency to turbocharge the experience of the present moment. And that turbocharging of the present moment tends to cause erratic behavior, difficulty in relationships, but also the intensity of negative emotion, if it persists too long, becomes such a grind that in itself is a conduit toward relapse. So an examination of the mechanism there and what meditation strategies can be brought to it. The fourth module is called Difficult Interpersonal Relationships. So one of the things that's true of most addicts is that at some point along the way they made the decision that other people are so unreliable that they can't be counted on. And so it creates this opportunity in the lives of people who are to socially isolate themselves. And the experience of social isolation, particularly for us humans, which we're herd animals and organized in social groups, is so painful that the use of substances and behaviors to kill that pain becomes evident and necessary. I like to bring in John Bowlby's attachment theory as a way of examining the structure or the way that people structure relationships. The conditioning that we have as small children leads to these patterns of attachment that then form the basis of how we organize relationships. And in people who use addiction, often the capacity to organize secure relationships is quite limited. And so that the sense of security and well-being that can come from relationships is restricted, which has a tendency to lead to the organization of life around addictive substances and processes rather than around productive relationships. So over the next 4 weeks or so, I'll go module by module, one per week, and then talk really about the meditation approach for addressing these conduits for relapse. So if you're working with any kind of addictive inquiry in your practice, hopefully this will be useful. Thanks.